Hello, good evening. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone that said hello. Saturnian, Stony. I know Tanya was here earlier. Welcome. So, in lieu of the full moon this night or tomorrow night, wherever you are, the 13th, we're gonna start into The Moon-Eyed People, which is folk tales from Welsh America by Peter Stevenson. So let's learn a bit about the Moon-Eyed People. Oh, I just got out of the shower, so my pores are all open right now. All right. Quote, the Cherokee tell us that when they first arrived in the country which they inhabit, they found it possessed by certain moon-eyed people who could see or who could not see in the daytime. These wretches they expelled, end quote. Benjamin Smith Barton, New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America from 1797. Another quote here. I have heard my grandfather and other old people say that they were a people called Welsh. A Frenchman who lived with the Cherokees informed me that he had been high up in Missouri and traded several months with the Welsh tribe, that they spoke much of the Welsh dialect, and although their customs were savage and wild, yet many of them, particularly the females, were very fair and white, and frequently told him they had sprung from a white nation of people. Also stated they had yet some small scraps of books remaining among them, but in such tattered and destructive order that nothing intelligible remained. That's John Sevier, governor of Tennessee. Letter to Amos Stoddard, October 9th, 1810. Hey, cool gamer, welcome in. All right, let's get into the intro. Oh, wait, there's some really cool pictures in this book. So first I'll just show you the front cover. And then there's a little tiny pictures here. I'll just show you real quick. It's cool looking. And then an owl for the introduction. Introduction. A lone man wanders from swamp to swamp, searching for himself. An owl remembers she was once human. A woman is in love with two moons. A war over land enclosures leads to mass migration. A skunk chases a greedy bear from his home. A wolf girl visits Wales and eats the sheep. A Brecon preacher walks on the trail of tears. Welsh weavers make cloth for enslaved people. A mining settlement in Appalachia is described as being unfit for pigs. A spear-fingered monster is defeated with menstrual blood. A Welsh criminal marries an Indian princess. Lakota men who witnessed Wounded Knee reenact the massacre in Cardiff. And all the while, mountain women practice Appalachian hoodoo, native healing, and Welsh witchcraft. These stories are a mixture of true tales, tall tales, and folk tales that tell of the lives of migrants who left West Wales and settled in and around Appalachia, the Appalachian Trail, Appalachia. Oh, where am I? And settled in and around Appalachia, of the native people who were already living on the land, the enslaved people who had been forcibly brought there, and whose curious travelers who returned to their roots in the old country. They were explorers, farmers, hunters, miners, dreamers, hobos, radicals, showmen, singers, sailors, soldiers, storytellers, liars, witches, warriors, poets, preachers, tourists, colonists, political dissidents, political dissidents, social reformers, and wayfaring strangers. Those who left Wales had little idea of what lay ahead for them. Benjamin Williams of Mineth, Mineth Bach in Ceredigion was about 17 when he sailed for America. And then this is a little excerpt. Having sold the farm in the summer of 1838, we prepared to come to America. We set out in carts from... I wonder if that double L is the th sound. I think it is. In Welsh especially. Thedrod. We set out in carts from Thedrod to Aberrayron. We were there for many days, 175 Welsh people ready to embark for Liverpool in three sloops. We had to wait a few days before boarding the sailing ship. People over 18 years paid 20 lire, from 10 to 18 half price. Under 5 came free. The doctor came aboard and examined us to see whether we were fit for the voyage, and decided that many of the children weren't fit to sail. Some ill people were hidden, and when they were discovered, it was too late to turn back. 17 children, and all those under 10, died. Great sadness. Rahel crying for her children. 6 weeks of sailing through several storms, we lost the course for Baltimore and sailed toward Cuba before the elements subsided and we got back on the correct course. When the migrants landed in Baltimore or Boston, they were sometimes renamed by the immigration authorities, who couldn't pronounce or spell their real names. Those who spoke only Welsh were confronted with languages and dialects from Scotland, Ireland, England, Italy, Romania, Germany, Sweden, Hungary, Holland, Greece, Poland, Russia, Slovakia, Bohemia, French Canada, Latin America, and all parts of Africa and Asia. They crossed the endless ridges of the Allegheny Mountains with belongings tied to wagons and pack mules, and negotiated the purchase of land from companies who had taken it from people who already lived there. Many of the Welsh settled in Pennsylvania, where they encountered the Shawnee, indigenous people who spoke an Algonquin language. From Pittsburgh, they moved down the Ohio and Monongahela rivers through West Virginia to North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee, the area known as Southern Appalachia. Here they met the Anayanwia, who the colonists called Cherokee, a corruption of a native word meaning people who speak differently. They called themselves Salagi and told stories in an Iroquoian language. Salagi Gawanahisti. Salagi Gawanahisti. Tales the invaders couldn't begin to understand. They encountered enslaved people and their descendants, brought over on boats against their will, packed like sardines in the cruelest conditions, bought and sold like cattle, prevented from speaking their own languages. These people told their stories in a Black English language based on the shared African belief in Nomo, the idea that a word when spoken has the power of life, and its beauty told an oral history of forced migration. Folktales in all cultures carry memories of migration. Peter Henry Emerson, son of an American plantation owner in Cuba, published a little-known story that was told to him near Menai Bridge, Ynys Môn, in 1891. It tells of how the ancestors of the Welsh escaped persecution and taxation in Persia, built a great city called Troy, made their way through feast and famine to Brittany, and over the water to Brighton, where they were pushed over westwards and by successive invaders. There are migration narratives in the 14th century. Theifer, Gwyn, Ritter. Oh, wait, the double D is maybe the TH. One second. I have this book that explains how to pronounce the spellings of Welsh languages. One second. Hey, Saturnian, welcome. One second. Let me just snag that. Oh, I almost knocked that over. Okay. Hey, Sass, welcome in, man. Okay. The beginning of this book is so fascinating, but it explains the double D and the double Y. E is the double Y, right? Like Yggdrasil. Or no, wait, that's just one Y. The double D is the TH sound. Y is never a consonant. E. I before a vowel at the beginning of a word is consonantal. It is the plural ending, as in the plural ending ion. I. E and I. Doubled consonances. The double D is a single letter, not a doubled consonant. Double D is voiced th, as in thin or breath. But the voicing is more pronounced than in English. It is opposed to th, the unvoiced sound in breath. Breathe, thin, breathe. This is the sound that the Greeks called the Celtic tau. The tau. Okay, so Y is just E and double D is TH. Okay. I should read that whole thing. I'll do it next time. Man, it's warm. Okay. Enos Mon. Okay, so Menai Bridge, Enos Mon in 1891. So Brighton, which is okay, still the TH sound. Brighton. Where they were pushed over westwards by successive invaders. There are migration narratives of the 14th century. Leifer, Gwyn, Rither, DD is TH. Lifer Gwyn Rithurch, White Book of Rithurch. It's almost like Richard. Rithurch. Rodri. Anyways. In the tales known as Pader Kank e Mabinogi. Balls. This is going to be some interesting pronunciations. In the second branch of the manuscript, Branwen, sister of the king of the Brightons, is it Brythons or Brightons? It's Brythons. Brightons, is given by her brother Bendigidfran to the King of Ireland in an arranged marriage designed to broker peace between the two countries. She is forced to live in a strange land in order to work in the kitchens, where she is slapped around the face with a slab of meat each day. Her only friend, a starling who flies over the sea with messages for her brother. In the third branch, following the wars with the Irish, the king's brother, M- Mana- Manawyddan, Manawyddan, immigrates to England to find work as a craftsman, but he is too skilled at his job and is forcibly moved on time and time again until he finally returns home. He turns to farming and grows 3 fields of corn, only to wake up each morning to find the ears of his golden corn have been, eaten by a horde of proletarian mice. In the fourth branch, Blodwith, created from flowers by a man to satisfy the needs of his son, undergoes an internal migration from woman to owl and is banished to the dark as punishment for having desires and thoughts of her own. Hey, buddy. Hey, Code. Stony Faith. Welcome back. Awesome, everyone. Man, yeah, it's a warm one. This fan's working though. There's a lot of big pronunciations in this one. The tale of a woman turned into an owl is not uniquely Welsh. It also occurs in a story from the Turtle Island Liars Club, told by Hastings Shade, former deputy chief of the Cherokee Nation. Another member of the Liars Club, Sequoia Guess, that's a name, tells a migration story of how the ancestors encountered a group of mound builders in North Carolina and Ohio, discovered they were cannibals, defeated them in a war, and began building mounds themselves. There are mound cities all across southern Appalachia, built over 2,000 years ago, when Wales in America were only dreams. The Cherokee also have stories about the fairies, Yunwi Sunsdi, the little people. The author Robert Conley writes about John Littlebear, a renowned healer who believed that wherever he couldn't find something he was looking for, it was those danged little people who were always hiding things from him. And while the little people were mischievous, they also looked after anyone lost in the woods. Little Bear left them whiskey and honeycomb as a thank you, and in return they gave him a song to call them up when he needed help. In Wales, a farmer in the hills of central Ceredigion told me that the Tylwyth Teg had visited his farm all his life. Tylwyth Teg. Sometimes helping with the chores, sometimes playing tricks, hiding things, but he couldn't say too much in case they never came again. These memories of the little people from Ceredigion and Cherokee are not ancient. They are both 21st century. None of this should be a surprise. Folk tales have always followed people around like faithful old dogs. They migrate across geographical, political, and imaginary boundaries with no need for passports, hidden in the minds of explorers and refugees. The West Virginia folklorist Ruth Ann Musick's extraordinary collection of European folktales, Green Hills of Magic, contains many stories from southern Appalachia collected from first, second, and third generation settlers who came over to work in the mines in the early 1900s. Some were told by and about Welsh colliers, who were always ready with a joke and a shaggy dog story. These were the folks the Cherokee called the moon-eyed people, for they were small and pale, lived underground, and could see in the dark. In the storytelling traditions of both Appalachia and Wales are shared folk tales. The Welsh gypsy fiddler Matthew Wood told many fairy tales in the fantastical adventures of an archetypal cheeky boy called Jack, who fights giants, defeats dragons, and marries princesses. Matthew told his stories in the Romany language, often at gatherings on one of his favorite haunts, Craig Adern, Bird Rock, near Aber Abergynolwyn. Why? Oh, I think I'm starting to cool down a little bit. Appalachian culture icon Ray Hicks of Beech Mountain was renowned for his jack tales. told in liars competitions on the Blue Ridge in North Carolina. I've been to this place. I hiked here. Ray had part Cherokee ancestry, and both his traditions use the epithet liar to describe a storyteller. The Cherokee say gagoga, he or she is lying. This is not lying as we know it, but the tradition of tall tale telling, the art of keeping an audience believing you are telling a truth for as long as possible. In Wales, chwedlua means gossip as well as storytelling, and this mischievous tradition was embodied in the Welsh language tales of Irwin Jones Ponsian, who told of his surreptitious affair with a princess on a train in Pencader Tunnel. And there were the Pembrokeshire English tales of Shemi Wad Abergwan, who was carried across the ocean by seagulls to Central Park in New York, only to discover they had deceived him and dropped him in Dublin. There are animal fables, critter stories, from what the Ohio storyteller Lynn Ford refers to as the Affrilation tradition. Here are rabbit, bear, fox, possum, skunk, snake, and turtle stories from enslaved people with links to Cherokee and Muskogee that came from me through Uncle Remus. And there are the Welsh animal fables of Catwig the Wise, about mole, lark, owl, eagle, magpie, cuckoo, and a whole host of anthropomorphic animals written by the legendary Iolo Morganwg. Storyteller Phil Aquidi is currently exploring migration narratives from his own Welsh Nigerian traditions, while in New Zealand, Tony Hopkins is telling stories to explore his identity as a Black Cherokee. Oh, stay up there, yeah. My cousin emigrated to Appalachia in the early 1960s. She was studying Homer at University College London when she met an American civil engineer with a penchant for covered bridges, and they moved to work in the old Welsh settlement city of Morgantown, West Virginia, where they put down roots and raised a family. So I fell in love with the folk cultures of both Appalachia and Wales, two sisters who explore the world together with baking soda in their backpacks just in case. Baking soda was a cure-all on both sides of the water. My mother made me drink it when I had a bellyache. She spooned it into every cake she baked and rubbed it into cut knees. Boy did it hurt. The granny women of Appalachia swore by it too, as did the herbalist Clarence Catfish Gray of Jackson County, West Virginia, who ladled it into his potions and tinctures. The grannies call it sody. When I was little, I had a die-cast metal Corgi Batmobile from the Courageously Camp Batman television series, and it was the coolest car in the world. It was made in the Fetoy factory, which opened in Swansea in 1954, the year that Under Milkwood was published posthumously after Dylan Thomas's death in New York. I grew up thinking Batman was Welsh and Gotham City was Swansea. You could also buy cap guns, cowboy hats, and Indian headdresses from the toy shops. Join the I Spy Club, which featured a man in an Indian headdress as its symbol. And there were books about conversation of the Canadian beaver written by Grey Owl, who wore feathers in his hair, but was really Archibald Stansfield Bellamy from Hastings in Sussex. Amidst all the phony appropriation, there was Buffy St. Marie, born Canadian Cree and brought up in Massachusetts. She is a singer and pacifist who predated the hippie movement, was blacklisted by radio stations, became an inspiration to Joni Mitchell, created and financed a literacy scheme for Native American children, and wrote the song Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Buffy told a different story, another history, a bitter truth that was never taught in my schools. This was an awakening from innocence. The stories here tell of the past and present migrations of people between and within Wales and America. There are no ends or beginnings, no comforting morals, no boundary walls, and certainly no happy ever afters. They are snapshots of easily forgotten lives, a photographic album full of yellow stained sepia images in a chronological jumble, all of their own. These are folk histories, stories of people with confused identities who developed roots in more than one culture. I am not Anahu- Anahuia or Appalachian or Afralachian, but their stories are intertwined with the folk history of Wales, tales of grannies and grandchildren with mixed blood. For each of us has our own individual Mabinogi, though perhaps it's best not to think about it too much, or the little people won't come again. And that ain't no lie. All right, chapter 1. Wolf Girl visits Wales. Ooh, hair sticking to my sweaty scalp. Okay. And then here's the picture. Cherokee elders tell how some of the old ones could change into animals: bears, bison, owls, wolves, coyotes, ravens, jackrabbits, eagles, hawks, and frogs. This sounds exciting if you're into gothic fiction and graphic novels, and you like the idea of shapeshifting superheroes, or enjoy the darkness of fairy tales. But what if you were told these stories as a child, and all your friends heard them, and they happened in the remote place where you lived, and there were noises at night that terrified you, and the old granny who lived nearby told you they were true? We lived near one of those elders, and one day, while me and my 6 sisters were playing stickball, a dog came up and joined us. It was just a mutt, with one brown ear and one white, and a patch around its eye. Father found us and asked where we'd gotten that dog from, and we said we didn't know, but could we keep it? Father said he would see, maybe if it was still around in the morning. Next morning the dog had gone, but that evening it returned, and every evening, till Father said he would find out if it belonged to anyone. He asked around, but no one had lost a dog, so we kept it. And each evening we played games and threw rolled up socks for it to fetch. We put our arms around its neck and tried to wrestle it to the ground, and we hunted jackrabbits for it to eat. Then the dog got a bit frisky. It bit my hand and drew blood, and when I kicked it off, it chased Father's chickens, and he said if this didn't stop, it would have to go. And we knew what he meant. You know, bang. Well, us children didn't want to lose our dog. We tried to train it, but it still chased the chickens, so we caught it and took it inside and tied it to our old iron bedstead with baler twine and told it to hush. In the night, there was a howling and a hollering, and Father came in and the dog said, "Let me go before the morning." But Father knew the stories about the elders changing into animals, and he wanted to see who the dog really was, so he left it tied to the bed. In the morning, we found an old woman curled up on the floor at the bottom of the bed, and we recognized her as the old granny woman who lived nearby. He released her, and off she scurried. A week later, the old granny was dead as a squashed skunk in the middle of the road. The elders told Father he had a lucky escape. Old Granny was a cannibal who ate the youngest and weakest in the family, and she turned herself into a dog so she could play with the children and work out who to eat next. And that would have been me. I'm the youngest in the family, so if Father hadn't spotted her trick, I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. Well, after that, we upped and left. Father and all of us 7 girls. His granddad was a miner from Romania, and his granny a Welsh seamstress. So that was that. We came to Wales. We settled in a cottage high up in the Black Mountains, and the locals stared at us because we looked different to them and spoke a language they didn't understand. They had never heard Salagi before, and probably had no idea where Appalachia was. and thought we were the fairies. We weren't afraid of them. They were likely more frightened of us, especially as we all had pointy, hairy ears. We left them alone and moved around by night like cats and owls, and howling was heard coming from the woods. We kept sheep and goats, rabbits and chickens, and father made sure the farm buildings were in good repair. The farmers left us alone, though they thought it was odd that we never took our animals to market. Truth was, we needed all that meat for ourselves. Word went round our more superstitious neighbors that we were descendants of humans who had bred with wolves. Lycanthropes, that's the word. Soon we were blamed for every sheep that died, every cow that refused to give milk, every crack of a twig in the woods at night, and every nightmare of every child. After a flock of sheep were found with their throats cut, the air turned black with anger. Father said it was time to move on again. One night, by the dim light of the crescent moon, my family left, in a single line, carrying all their belongings on their backs, wrapped in shawls and woolen blankets. The farm became unmanageable and soon fell into disrepair. The corn refused to ripen, the hay crop was poor, and folk believed that the wolfman and his family continued to haunt their old homestead long after it fell into ruins. The wolf family had fled the country and settled in Cluj in Transylvania, where father had relatives. They spawned 1,001 stories and inspired countless writers and artists, not one of whom acknowledged that we had come there from Cherokee via Wales. As they grew, my sisters spread out across Europe, living hidden lives, relying on friends to supply them with haunches of meat, much to the pleasure of the local abaters and the displeasure of parents who feared for their children. Let me tell you a tale that my father told me. Oh my gosh, this is juicy. A man was waiting at a Welsh railway station when he fell into conversation with a tall man in a trench coat and a Trilby hat. Oh, a Trilby hat. The old man told the stranger that he had come home to help his father manage the farm. One morning, they found all the sheep with their throats cut. There were wolf tracks in the snow, and as they followed, the prince became human. His father's face turned white as the very snow, and he told his son that this was the work of his own elder brother, the boy's uncle, who was born with pointy ears, slanting green eyes, and forefingers longer than his middle finger. Years ago, his brother had left the farm, angry at receiving no inheritance, and now he had returned for revenge. So the farmer told his son to go before he was killed, and here he was, catching the train to leave Wales for America to start a new life, before his pointy-eared uncle caught up with him. And he stared into the stranger's shaded eyes beneath the brim of his hat, and asked if he believed the story. The stranger said yes, of course he believed him, and removed his hat to reveal long, pointy ears, slanted green eyes, and a forefinger longer than his middle finger, just like Utlunta, Spearfinger, the Cherokee witch who stabbed her sharp forefinger into children and tore out their livers. Wow. And I ain't going to tell you what happened next, because it was real messy, you can imagine, but the man never caught the train, and I still have nightmares about meeting Spearfinger. Back in Breconshire and over the border in Radnorshire, reports of sheep carcasses plagued the local farms. An incomer's pet wolfhound was suspected, along with a black panther that was escaped from a traveling menagerie, and a coven of local witches who were accused of unspeakable pagan rites under cover of darkness. The truth was more obvious, especially if you were brought up in the company of wolves and vampire slayers. It was me, the youngest of the wolfman's daughters. I came to Wales from the Cherokee Nation, but I didn't flee to Romania with the rest of my family. I stayed on the farm. I knew all about the stories of how the youngest of 7 children could be eaten by a witch dog. But I'm a dark girl, and I argued and fought with my father when he told me we were leaving. I spat on the floorboards and said we had already left one homestead, and I was not going to be chased away a second time by no man. I'd been bitten by that old granny witch when I was little, and I knew what I had become. After my father and 6 sisters left, I slept alone in the hay bales in the barn, avoiding the farmhouse for fear the neighbors would come for me. I prowled the hedges for beetles to eat, scavenged leftovers from dustbins, took carcasses from gin traps, stole cooling food from windowsills, and hunted for rabbits. But I couldn't resist the sheep. They were so easy, trapped by the fences and hedges that were there to protect them. They couldn't escape my sharp teeth. And I smelled the neighbors approaching long before they suspected I was there. They never saw me clinging to the rafters in the barn. At night, lying in the hay with warm blood in my belly, I told myself the stories father had told me. This one he called the White Wolf. An old man had 3 sons and a daughter, and he was cruel to them. His wife had died, and he took out his loneliness on his children, screaming at them, beating and abusing them. His daughter knew that something was wrong with the father, and she protected her brothers, wrapping them in warm blankets and covering their ears when the old man came home at night with too much liquor in his blood. And since the death, of his wife, people in the town had been found murdered and mutilated, and they feared being out in the dark alone. One night, when the old man went out, his daughter took his gun and followed him. Through dark streets, she traced his footsteps until she came to a quiet alleyway full of garbage bins and washing lines. She watched as her father turned into a great white wolf, and the ghost of a young woman appeared and kissed the old man, and his daughter knew this was her dead mother. The white wolf and the ghost lady prowled the streets, and their daughter followed silently and stealthily. She watched as they approached a small, untidy boy, a gutter snipe, a street urchin, and she saw her parents were about to attack, and she knew enough was enough. She took her father's gun, touched the trigger with her finger, and shot the white wolf through the heart. Her mother vanished, and oh, how their daughter cried for her lost parents. Time passed, more years than could be lived in a single lifetime. I became wrinkled on the inside, but still freckled on the outside. This is moving on. That was the end of of that little story. Okay. So time passed, more years than could be lived in a single lifetime. I became wrinkled on the inside, but still freckled on the outside. A field full of mutilated sheep was discovered near Pontrid Fendigade. Pont Pontrid Fendigade, and dog prints were found nearby. There were more sheep attacks and sightings of wildcats, or hideous half-creatures with slavering tongues that were believed to be breeding in the area, skulking silently along the hedgerows, remaining largely unseen until they pounced. The newspapers called it the Beast of Bont. It was time I laid low for a while and found another food supply. One evening, I was prowling along the shelves at the co-op in Aberystwyth, and was about to slip a leg of frozen lamb inside my parka when I sensed I was being watched. It wasn't the CCTV. I was so quick they never captured more than a blur. Only once did a security guard see me, but I disappeared before he blinked, and he concluded I was his imagination. But this was different. I could smell someone behind me. I turned and came face to face with one of those young men who have the look of a sensitive poet. Curly hair, hooded blue eyes, you know the sort. He knew I was stealing, and I knew he would say nothing. We met eye to eye. He smiled. This was totally awkward. I took him by the hand and whisked him out of the shop. All the security man saw on the screen was a young man scurrying away on his own, and he made a mental note of face and clothes for next time. I dragged the young man to an organic vegan cafe where I often passed these days, dreaming of gnawing on the customers' arms and enjoying their ignorance of a carnivore in their midst. He threw questions at me: where I was from, was I living on the street, why was I shoplifting, and why didn't I eat or drink anything when I was clearly hungry? I cocked my head to one side and asked him about his strange accent. He told me he was from the far north, Penlyn, Aber, Aberderon. I was leaning toward him now, staring into his eyes. I remembered another of my father's stories, told by his grandfather's friend, Anthony Booth, a Romanian from Cluj, who had immigrated to work in the mines in West Virginia. And here's that story. A young affluent couple called Erich and Lorraine Mestrovic lived in a fine house on the outskirts of the city. One night, they threw a party, and all was well until a blood-curdling scream shook the air, and a young man was found outside lying in a pool of blood by the fish pond. The flesh had been flayed from his body, and one arm chewed in two. Everyone agreed it was the attack of a wild animal. Next night, Lorraine went out into the garden for some air, and Eric heard her shriek. She had found another dead man and had seen a creature running away, dressed as an old woman. Suspicion fell on an old witch who lived nearby, so the villagers marched to her house, burned it to the ground, and chased her out of town. But there were more killings, one on the Mestrovics' patio, and now the whole town was consumed with fear. Then one night, Eric saw a beast dressed in a young woman's clothes attacking a man. He took his gun, and as his finger closed on the trigger, he realized the woman's clothes looked familiar. A shot rang out, and there was a howl. He ran to see if the man was still alive, and he found, lying on the ground with a bullet hole in her forehead, Lorraine Mestrovic. That was the end of that story. The young Welsh poetsman, or rather, the young Welsh poetman, which is one word, Welsh poetman, I had dragged from the supermarket looked as white as a startled jackrabbit in a car headlight. I was leaning right over him, staring wide-eyed, red lips twitching. He must have thought I was a vampire. Bloodsuckers were fashionable at the time. There was no end of films, books, graphic novels. I must have looked like a grown-up Eli from the Scandinavian film, who could only come into a room if she was invited. Though I like to think I look more like the girl who walks home alone at night. She's cool, much more me. I like Iranian films. No one goes to see them, so I can stretch out in the dark and scratch the seat in front of me with my fingernails. He asked me outright, was I a vampire? I laughed very convincingly, and I told him he had a vivid imagination, and that of course I wasn't a vampire. How ridiculous would that be? I was a wolf girl. He choked. A werewolf? I told him to hush. We were in a vegan cafe. And no, I wasn't a werewolf. I was a wolf girl. Werewolves were monstrous creatures that could change into humans, bloodthirsty men, or menstruating women, who would tear you to shreds as soon as smell you. No, I was human, just like him, but with all the emotions and abilities of a wolf. There is no outward transformation. I will always be who I am. I am a wolf girl. Dude. That was the end of that story. Ivan was a good-looking bear of a man who was engaged to a clever and strong young woman named Tina. She loved him dearly, but Ivan had been wounded in the head during one of the too many wars, and he had become like a child. Laughed at by the villagers, he ran away from Tina and hid in the hills, locked inside his own insecurity. A witch found him living in a damp cave. and persuaded him to sell his soul in return for being able to turn himself into a werewolf. On the next full moon, 3 men were found torn to shreds, and so it was, night after night, more and more deaths until the villagers became hysterical and said the werewolf must be killed. Tina decided she would hunt the creature. She loaded her pistol with silver bullets and set off for the hills. She found the werewolf hiding in a cave, and she raised her gun. It stared at her for a fraction of a second and held out a filthy paw. A flicker of recognition appeared between them, but Tina's finger twitched on the trigger, and before her mind could catch up with her instincts, there was an explosion of fur, and the werewolf fell to the ground. She watched as it transformed into Ivan, and now she saw him for the mistreated and misunderstood man that he was. She lay down by his side and held him until the lifeblood flowed from his veins into the dry earth. In the morning, they were found entwined with each other's arms. The dog rose, like dog rose and honeysuckle. The young Welsh poetman's eyes lit up. This was just too cool. He could write poems, maybe Siwith. It's Cywydd, Siwith. Maybe Siwith. And be all enigmatic with his friends. Yeah, this is my girlfriend. She's a wolf. Don't worry, she won't eat you. She's not a werewolf. They all change into animals where she comes from. He was going to take this very much in his stride. He was a Penlyn boy, after all. He took out a black moleskin sketchbook and asked if he could draw me. I didn't answer. I listened to the scratching of his pen while he drank a muddy cup of organic coffee with all the sweet things taken out. I ignored the slurping. He asked if I had anywhere to stay tonight. So I went back to his red-doored flat, and he invited me in. It was untidy, full of books about poetry and football, and a black cat with pea-green eyes. I felt safe for the first time in my life. It was a simple existence. It had to be, because he was a poet and therefore couldn't earn a living, and I was a kleptomaniac wolf girl. Food and money were scarce, but I did my best. He was so gentle and kind. He irritated the hell out of me, but as time passed, his kindness became overwhelming. He soothed me by reading while we huddled in the warmth of the fireside. I held him tightly when the storms rattled the door and listened to his heartbeat as it slowed until he prized himself out of my grip so the blood could flow round his body again. He kissed me on the hand when I sat alone. I liked him. I had never liked anyone before. It was beyond weird. Times were hard. There was no money in kindness and words, and my belly rumbled with hunger. We took to foraging, but nettle soup, mushroom pies, and mint tea did not satisfy me. I became hollow-cheeked and sunken-eyed, hunched of shoulders, shadows beneath my ribs. My old anger returned, flowing through my veins like poison. I made cuts on my arms just to watch the blood flow. One day, he found stains on the floor, and he grabbed me by the shoulders and asked if it was anything to do with me. I said yes, it was my period. I stared at my young man, chewed my black hair, and told him I needed meat. He emptied his pockets and found only fluff. I met his gaze, and he recoiled from my red eyes. He said he would get a job, work as a street cleaner or shelf stacker. He would beg on the streets, anything for the woman he loved. I stroked his cheek and licked his lips with the scarlet tongue and told him I would not see him lower himself. Before he could reply, I was out the door and returned later with a side of meat. That evening, we ate greedily. He never asked me where it came from. I wiped the grease from my lips, kissed him, stroked his black cat, who was purring on his lap, and told him a story. And here is that story. A wealthy man had gone bankrupt, so to pay off his debtors, He sold his mansion and bought a sawmill so he could cut down trees and sell the timber. He told his society daughter that they were moving to the woods, and she said, "What, in these shoes?" And he looked her in the eye and said she would have to sell off all her shoes and her jewels. Well, she was furious with him and told him no good would come of this, and she was right. On the first night, one of the woodsmen was found by the hut next to the sawmill with his throat cut out. Next day, he employed another man, and the same thing happened. A traveling man and his pet bear knocked on the door and asked for a bed for the night. The mill owner said he could sleep in the hut by the sawmill, but warned him that two men had been found dead there, and a wild beast might come on the loose, or might be on the loose. The man stroked his beard and said they weren't afraid, and went to the hut. The man curled up and was sleeping with his feet on the bear. When a long, sleek black cat squeezed through the keyhole and curled up on his face. He couldn't breathe and was almost suffocated before the bear awoke and tore off the left paw of the cat. There was a shriek and blood everywhere. The man picked up the paw, wrapped it in some paper, and in the morning told the owner what had happened. He unwrapped the paper, but instead of a cat's paw, there was a girl's hand with a ring on the middle finger. The owner turned white, for he recognized the ring as his daughter's. He went back to the house and found her lying sick in bed, with the cover pulled up around her. He asked her if he could hold her hand, so she held out her right hand, but he pulled down the cover, and the bed was spattered with blood where her left hand had been chewed off. She told her father it was his own fault for making her give up her society ways, and she changed into a three-legged cat and disappeared through the window. Poetman's eyes lit up, and he said he knew that story from back home in North Wales. A conjurer called Hugh Lude was sleeping at an inn in Betswy Code, owned by two sisters. Then two black cats appeared in his bedroom, and one placed its paw in his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took his sword and cut off the paw, and in the morning found one of the sisters with her hand wrapped in a bandage. He pulled out the cat's paw, and it was a human hand. That night, my poetman held me tight, and despite my lack of empathy, I felt something for him. It may well have been love, but how would I know? Each night, his wolf girl brought him meat, sometimes lamb, sometimes chicken, occasionally pork, often unidentifiable. He became concerned and asked if I was stealing from the butcher or farmer or the slaughterman. Or were people going missing, children even? Oh, God! Would the police come knocking at the door? He begged me to tell him where the meat came from. I became red-eyed and angry, took another bite from a lamb's leg, and the grease spattered onto his face. He explained that he was only concerned in case I was a thief, and I might be locked away, and he couldn't bear that, for he loved me so, and wanted to hide me from prying eyes. I placed my red fingernail to his mouth and scratched him lightly on the chin, drawing a sliver of blood, and I made him promise not to reveal what I was about to show him, and I kissed him gently and saw the sadness in his eyes. I took him by the hand and led him through the deep dark wood, past ruined stone cottages and twisted roots, to a lonely spot by a spring that spewed dark water and frog spawn. I stepped out of my clothes, wrapped my arms around his neck, and sniffed him. I licked his face, and my nose twitched, and I ran for the woods as Wolf Girl. I returned in the blink of a crow's eye with a dead lamb between my jaws, dropped it at his feet like a gun dog, and picked the fur from my teeth. I promised him all would be well, providing he stayed with me at all times to ensure no one was hurt. And so we hunted together, and he watched while I chased down some poor, slow creature. The more he watched, the more excited he became, and he wrote words about the thoughts of the prey animal in the last moment of its life. Each time I brought larger and larger haunches of meat, and although some were clearly pig or sheep, cow or chicken, others were not. He feared for everyone in the village, and listened to the gossip in the hope of learning whether anyone had gone missing. Excuse me. He washed his hands so thoroughly they became as red as raw meat, and he worried I might eat them. One autumn day, he was in the woods waiting for me to return, when I came hurtling through the trees with a lamb dangling from my mouth. I dropped the carcass at my man's feet and hurried past him without pausing, followed by a farmer and his black hunting dogs, red tongues lolling from their mouths. My man shouted, "Run, run fast, I love you!" And in a moment the blood in my veins froze and I fell to the ground as if shot. He ran to where I was lying on the ground, curled like a fetus, dribbling and drooling, while the hunting dogs circled me, sniffed the blood, and licked me clean with rough tongues. The farmer caught up with us, and I could feel him staring at my shivering, grimy body. He averted his eyes, not knowing where to look. Then he composed himself, raised his gun, and pointed it at my head. My man stood between his whispering wolf girl and the barrel of the farmer's gun, and he said he would take the bullet for me. The farmer told him to get out of the way, but this silly boy stood his ground. Time slowed in an endless fatal heartbeat, and for a moment I understood my life for the first time. I remembered my dad telling me a story when we were in the Black Mountains about a witch called Kate who lived in a Flemish-style farmhouse near Southern Down in the Vale of Glamorgan in the 1850s. They called her the Flanders Witch, and she could cure and curse, but mainly she looked after the local foxes and hares. The smugglers of Tresillian The smugglers of Tresillian Cave used to cross her land without asking permission, so she asked them to pay her with a bottle of Jamaican rum, a drop of brandy, a few eggs, and a little cream to mix together to make an eggnog, for medicinal purposes, you understand. When they refused, she turned them into wolves and trained them to bring her chickens alive so she could have eggs for breakfast each day. Everyone was terrified of Kate, but the stories of her powers did not stop the local huntsmen from riding through her garden and trampling her vegetables in pursuit of one of her foxes. They hadn't shown her the courtesy of asking her permission, so Kate reasoned with them, saying how they would like it if she walked through their gardens and dug up their croquette lawns and killed their pet cats. And anyway, the fox they were chasing was a personal friend of hers who had every right to borrow the odd chicken, for they had plenty to spare. Really, they should be ashamed of themselves. But the huntsmen were unrepentant, rather. They sat up there on their horses, looked down their noses at her, and threatened her to burn her house to the ground if she stood in the way of the hunt. Well, what could a poor, harmless old woman do in the face of such big, strong, powerful men? Well, this is what she did. She turned herself into a hare and ran out in front of the hunt, exciting the hounds so much they followed her, and not the fox. She taunted and tormented those hounds, and led the huntsmen through swamps and bogs, through blackthorn and bramble, until the dogs were covered in mud and slime, and the men's coats were torn by thorns, until the horses refused to go on. And all the while, the fox slipped into the huntsmen's houses and borrowed a couple of cheeses, some bread, and several bottles of wine. And that evening she and Kate had a fine feast at the expense of the men who had tried to hunt the witches of Southern Down. Time was still passing, but my final heartbeat was far from finished. My eyes were wide. I was breathing heavily and staring wildly into the distance, thinking of my father. The dogs were licking me, and my man was standing over me with the farmer's gun in his face. The farmer spat on the ground and said that now he knew I was a werewolf. He would skin the pair of us alive if I ever stole one of his sheep again, and he lowered his gun. My man spoke up and said that I was no werewolf. I was a wolf girl. And he wrapped me in his coat and lifted me to my feet, scooped me in his arms. He told the farmer never to make that mistake again, and he carried me home, took me to my bed, warmed me in his embrace, and filled hot water bottles for my cold feet. He spent his last few pennies on cat meat, made cuts in his arms, and drained his blood into the saucer for me to lap up. He picked up roadkill and searched the woods for dead and dying creatures. But as time passed, I grew weaker and paler and thinner, and I was wasting away. He stared at his hands and saw the fingers of a poet, not a killer. He followed the only option left to him, this gentle and kind young man. He took poorly paid jobs as a driver, a postman, a shop assistant, a night worker. He cooked me roasted sweet potatoes and told me it was chicken. I grew stronger and found a job stocking shelves in the co-op at night, and it kept me off the streets. He worked hard all his life, so hard that he never again wrote another word of poetry. We looked after the local foxes and hares and supported the reintroduction of wolves into Wales, only because he knew they would keep me company. In time, his hair turned to snow and he grew wrinkles around his eyes, while I never looked a day older than when I first met him, although I was wrinkled on the inside. We look an odd couple. People think I am his grandmother, but he has never stopped loving his wolf girl. And after all this time, I love him. I think. The end. And here's a little picture at the end of that. 101:35. Boom. Juicy. Well, dang. I'm kind of bummed that I loved that. I freaking loved that. Ooh, the next one's the Moon-Eyed People. We're going to do that one tomorrow. I wish I knew how to pronounce these words better. Someone from Welsh could probably narrate this a lot more more properly than I could. But I'm going to do it, and with all of my mispronunciations. Hey, Prelly, I didn't see you come in. Welcome, man. So I love yas. And oh my gosh, let me tell you something really funny real quick about mispronunciations. I just finished that alchemy book last night. And then I did some more research on alchemy today. And I listened to this really fascinating presentation speech by Frater Albertus. And because he's the one that's, he started that Paracelsus Society. And when I listened to it, the guy, hey, Angry Ginger, thank you, welcome. The guy who was introducing Frater Albertus, he did say Paraclesis once. And I'm telling you what, my whole life, I've thought it was Paraclesis. Every time I've encountered it, every time I've seen it. I mean, I was positive, Paraclesis. Like I've heard it everywhere. I don't know if this is just like a Mandela effect or what, but like his name isn't Paraclesis, it's Paracelsus, dude. Well, at least I know now. So yeah, I love y'alls. And I'll be back tomorrow. Probably with some Dolores Cannon and some Moon-Eyed People. But we'll see how it goes. Desert, sweet dreams, everyone. So until then, mwah! I'll talk to you soon. Take care.